Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for coming on such a beautiful evening. I'm Mike Waddington. I'm the president of the Association of Jersey Architects, the AJA. This isn't our evening, but we are helping with the filming of the talk from Tim. So I do need to let you know that we are filming, and the escapes are behind us on this side and here. So that's the housekeeping. We're delighted to support Tim Gill's talk. However, it's Emily Jennings, our local place-based champion and leading light, who's done all the hard work. In getting Tim over, so she will be introducing him. I just wanted, while I'm here though, if I may, to give you a very quick update on an exciting event the AJ is organising in October, Jersey Architecture Week. It's from the 9th of October to the 20th. It's at Capitol House. We're going to have talks, films, workshops, interactive events, and an exhibition. The theme is around playful places, connectivity, and our environment. So see you there, we hope. There'll be lots of advertising beforehand. Over to you, Emily.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. It's so exciting to see such a good turnout to explore how we can improve the play offering for our young people and all of us, actually, because play isn't just for children, it's for every age. But Tim is really the superstar. Legend in the play world. Started off with this book, No Fear, Growing Up in a Risk-Averse Society. At the Education Department, I'm incredibly excited to have him lead a workshop tomorrow morning. And then more recently, Urban Playgrounds. Tim is a global expert in play and in creating child-friendly urban environments. And it's been a privilege to have him here, explore the islands, lend his ear and eyes. And he's been on BBC Radio, at Channel 103, ITV, and more to follow. So thank you so much, Tim, for coming, and we're looking forward to hearing from you. And lots of opportunities for questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily. Emily is quite persuasive. Maybe some of you will know that. But she also gets stuff done. And one of the things that she got done is having met me about 6 weeks ago, I think, in London, through a mutual connection, basically said, we've got to get you over, can you come over before the end of June, da-da-da. So here I am, yeah, it's amazing to be back in Jersey. Actually, I was here about 15 years ago. Thank you, Mike, and the AJA for your part in making this evening happen. I'm really excited, yeah, I'm excited to be here to see what's happening on Jersey, and so I'm going to get stuck in. I'm going to start my timer. I'm going to speak for about 45-ish minutes or so, and then I think somebody's going to help do a Q&A, and we'll just let that roll for probably until we get bored. But I am going to start by asking you to do something and to do some thinking and some talking. And so I'm going to invite you to think about the kind of places that you used to play when you were younger. And I'm going to invite you to picture in your mind one place that you would say was your favourite place to play. And in a few seconds, I'm going to invite you to turn to the person next to you and to just take it in turns to describe that place. And then we'll do some quick feedback on that. So I'm not going to embarrass anybody, but I'll say no more. I'm going to give you about 1 minute and 23 seconds altogether, so we can speed through. So yes, find somebody or a threesome, your favourite place to play. Okay, time's up. Thank you for coming back into the room. Heard some interesting snippets of conversation mentioning, well, no, let's just see what we've got. Okay, so this is a quick bit of audience participation. I'm going to ask you 2 questions. In each case, if the answer to the question is yes, if you could just stand up, because we're all sitting down too much these days, aren't we? So stand up and then sit down again. So first question, please stand up if your favourite place to play was somewhere that was out of doors. Okay, and apologies for people who are, yes, hands up if if standing up is not your thing. Thank you. Sit down. I think we get a picture of the answer to that question. And now the second question, please stand up if your favourite place to play was somewhere that was not closely supervised by adults. Okay, thank you. I think fairly similar answers to both questions. I will confess I've done this exercise before. In fact, I did it this morning with ministers, more or less. I had a hunch about the kind of places that you might be thinking about. I think the kind of places that are most resonant from our own childhoods are often places that are out of doors and they're out of sight of adults. Places where we could have adventures, where we could explore, where we could kind of find out or get a sense of who we were, what we were capable of, where we could develop our friendships with our mates, and where the anxieties and worries of adults kind of receded into the background. Now, I know the nostalgia bell is ringing loudly now, and in doing that exercise, I'm not saying that there was some golden age of childhood, and or that today's kids are doomed because things are different. I'll come on to that. I think why I like starting with that exercise is because I think one of the things that we need to remind ourselves as adults is of that appetite for experience that children have. Children want to get to grips with the people and places around. They want to kind of figure out how stuff works, what they're capable of. Then we, for better or worse, we as a species are nature's most efficient learning machines. And much of what we learn and have learned throughout our species history, we learn through playing and exploring. And I think that's not widely enough recognised. So I'm going to sort of look a bit more closely now at that idea, that question about how things might be different for children today. And I'm going to show you this map. So this map shows you what you might call the roaming range or the home territory of 4 children. They're all 8 years old, but they're in 4 generations of the same family who all lived in the same city. So that big reddish blob that you can see that takes up most of the map, that's the roaming range of the great-grandfather in this family. So he could go 6 miles, 10 kilometres across the city on his own at the age of 8. And then you can see how the circles shrink with each generation until you get to that yellow dot up in the top left. So that's the son in this family. A few years ago now, he's allowed to go to the end of his street. And actually that's more of a kind of right to roam than most 8-year-olds get. Certainly in England, typically 8-year-olds would rarely be allowed outside the shadow of their own homes. So what this captures is what I call the shrinking horizons of childhood. And I think it's one of the most profound and underexplored changes in children's lives. And it's happening everywhere almost around the world, boys and girls. I'm guessing it resonates for people who've grown up here on Jersey. And it might be fun to even try and find a family that could do this. That would be interesting, wouldn't it? I've got some other versions of this map, but I won't show them tonight. And so again, it speaks to what I would hope we would agree was a kind of part of what childhood should be about, which is that children gradually spread their wings and gain independence, and in doing so kind of confidence and resilience and also responsibility and a feeling of connection. But fundamentally, as I say, I think this speaks to children's huge appetite for experience and discovery. And when we, by the way, the reasons why this is happening, I think it's complex, but it's a long story. I hope you can see that. And I think part of the picture is about the built environment. It's about the places where children are growing up. and that they're not places that invite or encourage children to be out and active and exploring, and that make it hard for parents to say yes to children to do that. And in fact, when we do ask ourselves what kind of places do we typically as a society do we create for children, that are kind of for them to explore and play, well, I don't think we do a very good job. It's a real play area. There was some debate this morning when I showed this to ministers about whether this was some kind of, AI or CGI creation. This is a real play area in Chesterfield. Now, I hope you share my dismay, but and obviously, it's poor. Better playgrounds are available, but it speaks to a certain contempt for children. But I also think, and I'm going to suggest to you, it's the wrong model. Okay, when we're thinking about how to make neighbourhoods that nurture children and allow children to feed their appetite for experience, to play, to explore, to get around, we can't just rely on playgrounds. Playgrounds are part of the picture, but they're not by any means the whole picture. So, here's how I'm going to go through the rest of the 40 minutes or so. I'm going to say what I think is the picture, what I think we should be aiming for in terms of this concept of child-friendly urban planning, why I think it matters not just to children, a case study from one city, and also a bit of what's happening in my own city of London, some thoughts on making it happen, and then really some tentative observations based on what I've seen in the 4 days since I've been here on this visit. And this is not just sort of my views. One of the things that's interesting to me is that there are a growing number of cities around the world that are taking seriously the idea of making their neighbourhoods better for children and young people, and making them better in physical terms, so, architecture, design, and landscaping. And I write about them in Urban Playground. Now, these are not necessarily cities that are very child-friendly right now, but they're all cities where the city leadership has put time and money into programs and initiatives. They're a mix of cities. I'm sure there's some lessons for here in St Helier and elsewhere on Jersey. So I'm going to do some definitional stuff. If we think about what makes neighbourhoods work for families, what are the kind of things that families are looking for, then in really simple terms it boils down to kind of 3 planks or platforms. So one is housing. Obviously, neighbourhoods that don't have housing suitable for families, affordable for a range of families, there are not going to be families living in those areas. The second is services, schools, childcare, other services that are relevant to families, of course, retail, health. Those are also, it's game over if those services are not there or not good enough. But the third element, the third plank, is the public realm, and that's what I'm most interested in and where I'm focusing on this evening. So this is, the streets, the parks, public spaces, playgrounds. It's and it's where children kind of step out of being just members of a family or being, school pupils, and where they kind of stake their claim on public life, where they start to, interact with, discover, engage with the wider community. So I think it's where the most interesting questions arise. And it's also important for families. Families may move to places where there is not good public space, but in general they don't tend to stick around if they can. Families that are mobile will move out of towns and cities that do not have good streets, parks and public spaces. So let's zoom in on that public realm, and I'm offering you here in this diagram a kind of framework for a child-friendly place, and it's the most important diagram in my book, so I'm going to just unpack it a little bit here. What it's showing you is that there are 2 dimensions. In physical terms, there are 2 dimensions to a place working well for children. The first dimension, along left to right is what you might call the things to do dimension. Yeah, a child-friendly place has lots of choice and variety of things to do. I think we can all recognise this, those of us who have children or take children on holiday. Yeah, and when we go places, we don't just want to have the same thing every day. So yes, parks, green space, nature, sports, recreation, all of those offers the things to do axis. But the other axis is just as important, maybe even more important. That's the mobility axis. This is how easy is it for children and families to get around. Crucially, how easy is it for children to get around on their own? Because newsflash, children do not drive. Okay, we'll come back to that topic. But in the meantime, we're only in the child-friendly quadrant if we're in a neighbourhood or a place that has both a lot of choice and variety of things to do and places to go, and where it's easy for children to get around on foot or by bike. So this is now becoming quite familiar work from various cities, and it runs through my book and my work like a stick of rock, and especially that focus on mobility, which I think is often neglected. So, just a last word. It's sometimes you see people differentiating between what might be called hardware and software in this topic. And in simple terms, hardware is it's like the bricks and mortar, the streets, the landscaping. You can see examples of both. These are both, of course, from St Helier. On the right is an example. It's a bit more at the software end. It's people doing stuff, organising events or programming in the existing public realm. So that's a school street scheme that has just, I think, started here in St Helier. Can somebody? Yeah, in the last year or even? And yeah, so that's a really interesting. There's a global movement. So the idea is that you stop the traffic outside of school during school days every day for about maybe half an hour or an hour at the beginning and half an hour or an hour at the end of the day, and the main reason is to get more families to walk and cycle to school. But it also creates this impromptu play space, which was exactly what we saw this morning, Emily, was it not, when we drove past? It's kind of wonderful. But all I'll say is that I think that software-hardware distinction is a helpful one, but just as with computers, if your hardware is rubbish, then software will only take you so far. So I do tend to focus on the hardware in my work, but software can be, in this context, it can help with maybe, temporary projects, with increasing take-up or activity in spaces at the beginning of a redesign and so on. And also, and I shall come back to this, in terms of the physical elements, I think there are four key elements that we need to be thinking about. We need to be thinking about streets, the links between places, in other words, walking, cycling, scooting, public spaces themselves of different types, and then housing is the last one. And just to remind ourselves that there are lots of different types of public space. This is just a list. There are other lists. Children play in lots of these types of spaces. They don't just play in playgrounds. One of the problems of the kind of, if you like, the playground mindset is that there's a kind of implicit message that, yes, children can play in the playground, but they shouldn't really be playing anywhere else. Now, I'm not saying children should be allowed to play absolutely everywhere, but I do think children should be allowed and, if you like, invited to play in lots of places beyond the playground. So, that's the theory, if you like. I'm going to now show you one neighbourhood that it's a provocation, but I'm offering it to you as perhaps the ultimate child-friendly neighbourhood. So this is a district called Vauban. It's in Freiburg in Germany. I've got a few slides, but that overhead, maybe you can see, it's apartment living. It's reasonably dense. It's probably a bit denser than St Helier, maybe about the same. It's quite green, as you can see, but what really marks Vauban out from other developments like it is that it's, to all intents and purposes, car-free. Okay, so you can see the image on the right. There's very low levels of car ownership in Vauban. You can own a car, I'll come back to that, but because there's low levels of car ownership and the parking is out of the picture, what it means is all of that space between the buildings is available, it's usable, playable, welcoming public space. So let's see what it looks like. One of the things that's interesting about Vauban is there's a lot of green space, but there aren't so many fenced off, segregated playgrounds. Instead, what you have is play offers woven into the parks and green spaces as here, and as these two images here. And there's a lot of variety, but they're always kind of well overlooked by the residences and directly accessible for families. The streets are full of people walking and cycling to get around, because that's how people get around in Vauban. That's one of the car parks, so you can own a car, but it's not cheap to do that, and if you do, you park it in one of a number of car parks around the edge. There's also great public transport in the form of a tram. By the way, Freiburg is, okay, it's about 250,000 population. It's significantly bigger than anywhere here, but it's not huge. They seem to do this stuff quite well in mainland Europe. And of course, the tram was built at the beginning of the development, so that takes away the demand from families to own a car in the first place. So that, as I say, it's a provocation. For me, it's a kind of, it's like a compass point or a lighthouse project. You can't do it everywhere. It's not a blueprint, but I think it's showing us what a truly child-friendly place looks like. And by the way, a steady stream of urbanists have beaten a part of Vauban over the last 20 years or so. Has anybody here been to Vauban? No? Okay. It's worth a visit, and Freiburg is a lovely city as well. Anyhow, everybody who visits remarks on how many children you see out and about in this neighbourhood. Children of different ages, boys and girls, with and without their parents, playing, getting around, the neighbourhood. So that's a kind of compass point. Why should you be interested? Why should you care about this approach and this idea? I was really interested to get answers to that question from the cities that I visited. Okay, so I spent a week or so in about a dozen cities. I've researched one or two more, and asked city leaders why they were putting money and resources into making neighbourhoods more child-friendly. And the answers that cities gave fell into three broad groups that you can see here. So a group of cities talked about children, talked about children's rights, children's health. I haven't said too much about that, but I'll come on to that. But essentially the benefits and an explicit child-centred rationale. Then there was a second group of cities that talked more about sustainability or maybe community, but basically this idea that a child-friendly place, what does it look like? It's green, it's compact, it's easy to get around on foot or by bike. It looks a lot like a sustainable place, so that you can make the case for sustainability on those grounds. But then, there's the third group of cities, in a way the most interesting and potentially perhaps interesting here, who had quite hard-nosed economic reasons for being investing in this idea. So these were cities that, in short, they accepted the argument that a town or a city or indeed a country that cannot attract and retain families is a city or a town or country whose long-term economic prospects are not great, to put it mildly. And the most interesting city for that story is Rotterdam, which I'm going to say a bit more about in a minute. But before that, just a bit more about the sort of health arguments. There's a lot of interest and concern, I'm sure, here on Jersey, but in many, particularly English-speaking countries, about children and young people's mental health. And they're beginning to be a really interesting conversation about the connections between the problems created around kind of screen use and particularly social media amongst adolescents, and the lack of play opportunities, particularly play opportunities a bit, back in younger years. So the simple argument, as suggested here by Jonathan Haidt, is that children are not developing the kind of resilience skills or just general kind of competence and confidence of being out and about in public space when they're younger, that then helps to equip them for the more turbulent world of adolescence when they grow older, and that screen use exacerbates that problem, but also creates its own problems. Now, I think, I mean, I think the argument is nuanced, but I think there is I think he's offering some new insights into this debate. And crucially, one of the things that he's saying, yes, we need to think about how we can intervene in children's digital lives, but we also need to think about making it easier for children to just be out playing, interacting, socializing IRL in real life. And that's where I think things get interesting. A bit on the economics. This is a slightly complicated chart, but what you're looking at here is that there's a big study of the economic factors in North American cities that link with economic growth. And so this simple chart shows you what those correlations are. So the longer the arrow, the stronger the correlation between different factors and economic growth. And what you can see is that the single longest arrow of this sample size of several hundred North American cities is having people aged 30 to 34, right? So basically the age at which many people start to think about having children. And then another long arrow, so quite strong correlations, again from that middle box, is actually being married with children. So there are clear links that back up that intuitive argument that I mentioned earlier about the economic rationale for thinking about creating places that work well for families and children. And that is sort of a nice story behind that is this is a photo of a Granary Square in King's Cross in central London, one of the most prominent high-profile master plan developments in the last 150 years in my city, which I had a bit of a hand in. And Roger Maidlin, who's made himself a very large sum of money. I think he maybe came to speak here at the AJA. Yeah. So he's worked. I've worked for him a few times over the years. He's very clear that, you know, for him, creating vibrant, family-friendly places is part of what is like a kind of success tick or a badge for a place that shows that it's working well. And finally, just coming back to children, if we take the time to talk to children and teenagers about what they like and don't like about where they live, which actually you're doing here, and I'll come on to that, their answers are incredibly consistent and have been for 20 years or more over many cities all over the world. They like to be able to get around and having choice and variety of places to go and to meet their peers. They like green spaces, trees are a big thing, and they don't like traffic-dominated places or places that are run down. And so you can see it maps very closely onto that framework that I mentioned earlier. So I think one of the takeaways from that is maybe let's move the conversation on rather than just keeping on asking children and teens those basic questions and think about how we can do some of this stuff a bit better. Okay, Rotterdam. What's interesting about Rotterdam is that it has invested tens of millions of euros over a 12-year period in a very smart way to make its neighbourhoods work better for children and families. And so it's the city that's probably put the most effort into all of this and in the most, strategic way. And down to the fact that it even invested in some neighbourhoods so that it could then do some, basically crunch some numbers and find out the impact. So what did they do? Well, a bunch of stuff, but one neighbourhood that's quite interesting is a kind of 19th century neighbourhood, slightly run down, just outside the city centre, where a group of agencies came together working with local people. So you've got the two levels of local authority in the city, schools, several housing agencies, community groups, all coming together to put into place a kind of comprehensive makeover of this patch of the city, improving school grounds, public space, playgrounds, greening streets, sports and leisure facilities, all coming together. And so they're a bit of a flavour of what's been going on in Rotterdam. This is actually, that's slightly dim, isn't it? A full disclosure, this is not a street in that neighbourhood, but several neighbourhoods in Rotterdam. What they've done is taken out car parking on one side of the street in residential streets, widened the pavement so that you then create a genuine doorstep play space. They can't do it everywhere, but this is actually in policy in the city. And one of the reasons why that's interesting, anyone who's been to Rotterdam will know it's not your typical, you know, crinkly, canal-y, medieval Dutch city. It was bombed so severely during the Second World War that it was more or less built from scratch, or large sections were rebuilt, and they were rebuilt in a kind of North American car-centric fashion. And that continued through well into the 70s and 80s. So it's only comparatively recently that Rotterdam's been unwinding some of that. So that's another reason why I'm interested in the city. Here's a playground makeover in that neighbourhood that I just showed you. It took a patch of the neighbourhood that had a tired old playground in it, but also some parking, took out the parking and put in something better. This is some school grounds where again you've got a kind of green makeover, and also the schoolyard is open up for the public to use outside of school hours freely. Seems like it's quite easy to do in the Netherlands. It's not easy to do in England, I can tell you that. I gather it's not easy to do here either, but why is that? Can we not look at that? There's also some programs that have been running in the city centre of Rotterdam. They're a bit more aimed at, you know, both downtown residents, but also tourists and day trippers. So this was a makeover of quite a windswept modernist square for a whole year to make it more child-friendly. This stuff has been embedded in policy. So one of the things that happens in Rotterdam now is that they have a kind of neighbourhood by neighbourhood review process, a planning process that looks at things like the distribution, the location, the quality of different types of green and public space, and also those connections and severances, and figures out where there might be gaps and where those can be improved. So that's all the story of Rotterdam, and they have found that these interventions do indeed lead to more families moving into the target neighbours. And I forgot, so in a way I can now use a punchline. So the punchline is that all of this came about in Rotterdam because in 2006 there was a very comprehensive survey of Dutch cities that showed that Rotterdam was deemed to be the worst city in the Netherlands to bring up a child. Okay, and the city leaders realised that was not good. So this for them was exactly the result that they were looking for. So you can see why I devoted a whole chapter to Rotterdam. London is different in many ways, but there's still some interesting things happening in London. We do have policy in London. We have planning policy that I had a hand in back in the day to write, that essentially says in new developments, we have a quantum of space, so there should be 10 square metres per child. So planning, new schemes need to estimate how many children might move in and create space for that number. A typology of spaces of different types with different age groups of children in mind, and so on. There's been some agenda setting work in terms of reports. A couple of the boroughs, so out of 33 boroughs, 2 of them have produced their own guidance and research and documents on child-friendly living. And there's a historic programme that's really interesting, which I'll just briefly mention, which happened in South Islington, which is EC1. And really briefly, that was back in the days of the Labour government and its comprehensive regeneration programmes, one of which was in a rundown part of Islington and had a strong focus on public space. You can see a couple on the left, a kind of quirky park feature. On the right, a street that's not just been closed to traffic, but where there's been these playful elements put in. I still take international visitors on study tours of this part of the city because 15 years after the programme finished, a lot of what got put in is still there and still doing a good job. We've also got the Olympic Park in London, and there's some pretty impressive public spaces that have been included as part of that, including the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park, with a couple of images from that. This is an unsupervised public playground. I hope you agree it looks a bit different to that one I showed you right at the beginning, and in fact it's won several awards. But in a way, the most interesting thing that's going on, or in terms of child friendliness, is one of the first new housing areas in this big new chunk of the city that was being built. It's called Chobham Manor, and we've now got post-occupancy evaluations. So the architects in the room will know that those are really valuable, getting direct feedback and stats from people who've moved into a neighbourhood. And it's a very detailed study, but the thing that leapt out for me, and indeed for the officers who were involved in it, was there's a central green in the housing, and it's become, the report describes, the beating heart of that community. There's some play features, but there's also, it's a linear park. One side of the park is directly accessible from the housing. There's a relatively quiet street along the other side, and you know, it's helped to create a sense of belonging in this new community of people who moved from all over, including, by the way, social housing as well as private rent and for sale. So that's been a real success story in that part of London. Okay, briefly I'm going to say a bit about what I think needs to be in place to get some of this stuff to happen. I've already mentioned the 4 building blocks. I'm going to say a bit more about each, and also about what I could see from those municipalities, those cities that had made some progress in this. I'm going to say a little bit about participation and then close with some thoughts about, I'm talking about children, but I'm not just talking about children. So those are the building blocks again, just to remind you. Streets can be great places for children to play and for people to meet. My own borough in London, Waltham Forest, was one of the boroughs that got a chunk of money from the Mayor of London, from Boris Johnson, to, it was called Mini Holland, and the idea was, that we were going to kind of learn from the Dutch. And this is one of the sort of flagship projects in that. So this is a mostly pedestrianised and revamped street, a little square. I think there actually is a pétanque course in there, so that's nice, isn't it? And you can see, I mean, it's become a really lively place. It's like suddenly there's a little bit of the Mediterranean that has arrived in my neighbourhood. And this is, Walthamstow was not, I mean, it's up and coming, but we're not talking about Knightsbridge here or Chelsea here. So it shows you what's possible in streets. Coming back to this software idea, so this is a slightly different image of us. This is a residential street in Worthing, and it's where they're running Play Streets programs. So a bit like with school streets, in a Play Street you have a kind of regular road closure, or the street is closed to traffic, typically on a Sunday where there's very low levels of traffic anyway. It's not just for, Independence or Liberation Day or the Monarch's Day. This is on a regular basis, so families can come out and play. And you can see here that a lot of families come out when these programs run. So that's a couple of ideas about streets. I want to just also do another provocation about public space. So what you're looking at here is a square in Bilbao, northern Spain. It's called Plaza Nueva, and it's one of the most playful places I've ever visited. It was just there on a holiday. But on Friday and Saturday night, this square becomes completely colonised by families, probably 3, maybe 4 generations. The colonnades, yes, there are shops and cafes around the edge. It is quite an attractive sort of probably 18th century, but it's not upmarket. And also, there is seating around the edge of this hard landscape space. So you don't have to buy a coffee to sit and enjoy being in this space. And I think that's really important. And so what happened on the 2 nights that I was there was that earlier on in the evenings, younger children would take over this space. And, you know, there'd be chasing and ball games and messing around. And then a bit later on in the evening, they would go off home and the teenagers would come out and they would hang out in this space. And because it was Spain, later on meant, you know, about midnight. And then they would kind of hang around and mess about and do teenage versions of what the younger children were doing earlier. And what was really interesting about this, in case you missed it, is that there's not a single piece of play equipment in this space. There is nothing in this space that actively says you can play here, but there was a kind of permissive culture, obviously, and it was also a fun space, so that flat surface meant that kids could scoot, and that girl, just there, she's doing healing. Remember Heelys? I think Heelys might be coming back now. Are Heelys coming back? My daughter loved Heelys. And so it's just a reminder that there are many ways to create or for playful spaces to emerge. We don't just need to rely upon fixed equipment playgrounds, which I think can become a kind of I've sometimes talked about the tyranny of the fixed equipment playground. Play equipment is great, playgrounds can be good, but they are absolutely at best part of the picture. And then finally housing, and in particular thinking about the relationship between the housing that we build and the public spaces that are immediately outside the housing. And there's now a growing body of research that shows if you can create public space that's shared, that's flexible, that's a community space, and that is immediately accessible from front or back doors or gardens, then those spaces just become vibrant, lively places that families will dwell on. And this is a small scheme in Cambridge called Marmalade Lane that's won several awards. So I said I promised to say something about the sort of municipal mechanisms. One of the things that I found from the cities that I visited was that quite often, not always, but quite often, you had this sort of what I call a hub and spoke model. So you had at the middle an officer, an official, often supported by a politician, but not always, but they just got stuff done. They had, in particular, they had links to both planning and transport. They also linked to public space. They knew how to kind of do good involvement and bring different stakeholders together, including children, families, but also those other stakeholders, maintenance people, businesses. There was a focus on residential neighbourhoods. I can't emphasise that enough. Families often don't live in towns or cities. They live in neighbourhoods. And so we need to think about and focus on the neighbourhood as our kind of unit. The best cities, not all of them, also just actually gathered data and figured out the impact of what they did, as you saw in Rotterdam. So, a last word, on participation. I've mentioned about focusing on neighbourhoods. And that gets away from this problem that often you can get kind of scraps and fights and differences of view about a single space. And we just need to kind of raise our sights a bit and look more broadly at the places where families live. I'm a fan of participation. I haven't talked much about it, but I think where it works best, it's often where you can get adults to actually listen to and be in the room with children and hear children of different ages. And that those children are speaking about what it's like for them to live in this place. But I don't think we should expect children to have all the answers. Actually, I think that's our job as adults. And that's where I think that expertise and insights into what's worked elsewhere can really help. So I've got a few minutes to just share you some thoughts about what I've seen here. And this is the summary. And I mean, okay, I'll just read through it. I haven't seen a lot of play space, either in the rural parishes or in the more built-up areas. Most of what I've seen has not been that great. There have been a few examples that I think are great. I'll show a few in a minute, but some are frankly rubbish. Definite lack of spaces for teens. That's not unusual. That we see that a lot. I'm told, and I think I've seen a little bit myself, that the kind of free play that used to happen in some of your nice countryside and on your beaches is not happening so much. Again, there may be lots of reasons for that, but that seems to be a pattern. The island is not a great place to get around on foot or by bike. The whole of your public realm is very car dominated, and people have said to me, yeah, but that's the Jersey way. That's, well, you know, and people have been saying, Tim, be careful, you know, don't ruffle the feathers, because you'll get people, powerful and influential people, annoyed if you say cars are a problem. Well, in a way, this is one of the benefits of being, right, I'm flying home tomorrow. I can say cars are a problem, and then I can be out of here. But really, everywhere cars are a problem. And I know that there are particular challenges in Jersey because, you know, you're not going to be able to build railways, or probably even, I don't know, maybe you could build a tram, but probably not. And you've got a rural hinterland that has, you know, a lot invested in their cars and an expectation about being able to use them. You also, and somebody told this to me, this is your city. Here, St Helier is one of the few significant cities anywhere in Europe where people regularly drive straight through the city and out the other side to get from one side of this patch to the other. Now, I'm not saying it's easy to solve that, but it's surely we can all agree that's a problem. And yeah, you're, for want of a better word, downtown St Helier is a kind of a bit of a mess. I mean, there's some nice parts, but it's not coming together in a sort of coherent way, and it probably could be a lot more vibrant and welcoming and connected and people friendly and playful. So let's see what I saw. I saw some nice parks and play spaces. This is Coronation Gardens. I saw the skate park, which is amazing, and I know we've got Jersey Skates representative here. That's a world-class skate park. And I'm a fan. Confession time, I did used to skate as a teenager. It's been a while, but, you know, so it has a place in my heart. But I think we also need to recognise that often when we think about teens, there's a sort of default, oh, we need skate parks or wheeled parks. Oh, and maybe we need ball games areas. And I think there's certainly some research coming through from the UK that that's not enough. It's particularly not enough for girls. It's not, maybe also there's a big cohort of boys that are not into skating. There is a significant, so I just want to say yes to these facilities and other things that are going to work for other teens. I think Millennium Park looked lovely to me, and there's a nice mix of spaces. The play park is nice, it's got trees in it. It feels kind of vibrant. I saw some kids just playing on the green outside the play area. This is an interesting space. So this is a housing space that we visited, and it's just a nice little combination of rooms that families and children can get to from their back doors. Where is this, Emily? Opposite Springfield. Lecoy. And you can maybe just see there's some chalk marks up here. And when we arrived, there was a pink bicycle, a small girl's bicycle left in the playground. Those are clues. We call them play traces that children and families not only using that, but kind of feel some ownership of it. And this is Emily's new park in St Martin that's got a decent amount of space. It's got some greenery. There's a nice lumpy bumpy hill on the right there, some challenging equipment. The family that were there were very enthusiastic. This space not far from here, outside the Arts Centre, it's kind of going in the right direction. I sort of feel a bit like maybe there's not quite enough seating, and then there could be something that's a bit more explicitly playful here. But this is kind of sad, and I've seen a few of these in the parishes. You've got a formal space, you know, with planted flower beds, very ordered, visual amenity, yes. And then you've got this, you know, segregated play area that looks quite sad. I have seen some children getting around on bikes. This was near to the skate park, and also I think it's also on that, or near to the one like nice cycle route that you've got that was the old railway line. So that was nice to see. There's some bits where the connections aren't working, so this is, help me, Emily, where's this? People's Park, Christmount, where you can just see, so the play park is just right over on the extreme right. There's a lot of housing over on the left. I mean, okay, there is a pedestrian crossing, that's good, but there's no desire line, there's no natural kind of route or invitation into the park. In fact, you get across the pedestrian crossing. I think that should be stronger anyway. It should be wider, it should be more, it should actually slow traffic down physically, but also it's not connected. So it's a small thing, but it could be better. But this is, I'm sorry, this is sad. It's sad, it's worse than sad, it's bad. So this is a play park in one of the Angium housing areas, Jate. And you just, nothing's right about this. Nothing is right about this. It's in a car park. There's no shelter there. The only seating is outside the fence. It's really hard to get into this space on foot. There's only one entrance in or out. And it's not even anywhere near the housing, including the housing that is actually backing onto it. We saw 4 children when we were filming here earlier. While we were filming, 4 children came through this space. They weren't interested in the play area, but they had to climb over the walls to get to where they wanted to go, to and from school, because there was, okay, so for them you could say, yep, bit of physical activity, that's good, some adventure, but if that's a mum with a pram, it ain't going to happen, is it? So surely we can do, this should not be happening. And actually you could reconfigure this space with a bit of creativity. You could open up, take down some of those walls and gate and fencing, even without losing any parking. You could move the parking around. You could create a much more welcoming, sociable green space with some shade and some seating. Maybe you could keep some fencing, you might need that, but we could do so much better. Okay, I'll move on. I just want to say a bit about some of what I found about some of the data in Jersey. So you have some good mechanisms for involving children and young people. You have a youth parliament, and I know we've got some representatives here. You do some good data gathering about what they view, what they say, and generally they do agree that adults take their views into account, but look how that drops off in years, starting in year 8 and year 10 and year 12. Way fewer young people say yes, adults do listen to us compared to young people. So I think that's something we should be taking note of. And also, again, like many other parts of the developing world, of the high-income world, when it comes to the hard facts about your children and young people's health, you're not doing very well. So you've got very poor levels of physical activity. You've got significant numbers of children who are showing various mental health problems. And I suspect that's going to get worse before it gets better. And you've also got children and young people themselves telling you that they face significant barriers in getting out and being active. So the final sort of message to you is, I'm going to quote this guy. He is the mayor of Bogota, or was, sorry, former mayor of Bogota, famous urbanists, and really helped to transform that city, which you won't be surprised to hear was not a great place to live 30 years ago. Okay, it was a hellhole. And he did all sorts of things, but one of his maxims was talking about children as a kind of indicator species for cities. And I want to leave you with that message and that vision that, in the same way that if you see salmon swimming up a river, that's the sign of a health of that habitat. If you see, like in Vauban, in Freiburg, if you see children of different ages, with and without their parents, active and visible in a town or a city or a village, that is a sign of the health of the human habitat. And so that really is the vision that I want to offer you this evening. And I will stop at that point. Thank you very much. There are some mics over there.
Okay. Thank you very much for listening, and we've got an opportunity for some Q&A now. We can pass some mics around, if Mike's happy to do that.
As I'm the first up, I'll cheat and ask you 2 questions, okay? The first one is, what about people who are struggling to be mobile? So obviously we're talking about trying to remove cars and vehicles. Well, there are obviously people who can't walk any distance at all.
Yeah.
So how do we accommodate those in that space?
Yes. I think the word I'm reaching for is inclusive, and I think inclusive spaces do recognise, or all places, towns, cities, that not everybody is equally able. And so that goes in playground design. We need to recognise that not all children have the same, even of a similar age, have similar physical abilities, let alone inclinations. And for adults, it's also true. I think that there's lots of experience from other towns and cities that you can create neighbourhoods that allow good access for those people who need it by car, and still kind of promote walking and cycling. So in my own neighbourhood in Waltham Forest, there are a few streets that are, in effect, they're policed by cameras, automatic number plate recognition, APNR cameras. And if you go down those streets in a car, or if you go down at certain times of the day, you'll get a ticket. But there are exemptions. So there are exemptions for residents who actually live on that street, and there are also potentially exemptions for people who have blue badges. So in short, I think there are ways around that. And I'm not massively engaged in this sort of, what I think is rather unfortunately become a sort of culture war between, the car driver or the motorist and, I don't know, some mythical enemy of the motorist, not least because I am a motorist, but I'm also a cyclist, and I'm a walker, and I use public transport, and I'm a parent. So I'm not very invested in that, and I think it's a false conflict. And I think one of the ways that conflict can get played out in unhelpful ways is to say that there's this group of people whose lives will be ruined if we make it harder to get around by car. And in practice, I don't think that's always the case. It is the case that making it easier to walk and cycle, almost by definition, means making it harder for some people to use their cars. So the smart thing to do is to figure out how you do that in ways where the people who still are really dependent on cars can do that, and the people who can actually switch to other modes of travel will do so. And that nearly always causes a fight. Because I'm becoming increasingly interested in the long shadow cast by the growth of the car, and I think it's really deep, and it goes back 100 years or more to the dawn of the motor age in North America. And so I think some of that, we just need to open up and have a proper conversation about that, and I hope that will happen here on Jersey. And one of the messages, I think, is that, yes, I understand that many people are dependent on cars, but one group that really loses out in car-dominated places is children, because in car-dominated places, children become dependent upon the parental taxi service until they can start to drive themselves. And then, tragically, often, because we know that teenagers are not always the most effective self-regulators, they can then become a hazard to themselves and others when they get behind the wheel. So I think anything that moves us on from that track of embedding car ownership and car use is not just a good thing, you know, for the world and for the planet and for lots of older people as well, but is particularly good for children and young people. And it's what, as I've said, children and young people themselves often say. It's tough, and you know, it's really tough here on Jersey.
Very good, such an extensive answer. I'll pass it on to somebody else.
Thank you. It's something I think about a lot. And oh, somebody at the back. Are you coming on that topic, maybe?
Related to it.
Okay.
Hello, thank you for a very interesting talk. We have a concept of green lanes in Jersey, I don't know if you've come across them, where the cyclists and pedestrians have priority over cars. The problem is they're not policed, and therefore it doesn't happen in practice, and so people don't use them. There was a proposition brought by a member of the Reform Party recently, or a few years ago, to change that. It hasn't got anywhere. There's resistance from the constables. So I have two questions really. Well, one question and one suggestion. So the question is, how do you do that? Do you do it through policing, or do you ban the cars? And I suppose the suggestion is, could those green lanes be the link between town and country, if you like, if they were extended as a network? Because it seems to me that's one of our big challenges here, is that we can make St Helier car free, but then you cut off town from the rest of the island, and that's a big challenge.
Yeah. I don't know the answer to that question. I can offer some responses. I mean, I think that it's very clear to me that Jersey has some pretty unique characteristics in terms of transport. And so you're going to get people, frankly, who are much more informed and qualified to grapple with transport issues than I am to solve it. Because not only have you got what you've described, but you've got very tight streets almost everywhere. So you're not going to be doing massive road building. You've got a limited capacity to create public transport, and you've got, you're also quite a dense. I mean, your population density is 3 times the density of England, so you're actually quite a dense place. Leaving aside all the politics, but you mentioned green lanes. So for my sins, I helped to campaign for a model called the home zone, which is a sort of urban version of a green lane. So the idea is that in a home zone, pedestrians have priority, the street's given a makeover. It's a little bit like that street that I showed in my home area of Walthamstow. And that's in legislation now in the UK. It's a little bit watered down, but one of the things that came along with that was a quiet lanes designation. So it's very similar to your green lanes. So in a quiet lane, it's the rural equivalent where you've got a 20-mile-an-hour notional speed limit and signage, and that it's supposed to be a place, a lane that can be enjoyed for recreation as well as allowing cars. What I can't tell you is how effective that has been in England, and so whether there is a smart answer to your question. I'm wondering about whether there is scope for what does happen in some European countries, which is effectively a kind of a change in the law, so that if a driver hits someone in a green lane, this is hypothetical, other people can shoot me down. So it's a liability change, that the cars are still allowed, but drivers know that if they hit someone walking or cycling on a quiet lane, a green lane, they will be presumed to be responsible, even maybe criminally guilty. So that is the case in the Netherlands. I think in some other parts of Europe, it might be something that could be looked into, but it's a bit above my pay grade to know the ins and outs of it. But in general, the answer is, I think you should be looking at anything that might open up streets, lanes, other public spaces for different types of use is worth looking at. And are you looking to come in on this?
Yes. It's just I'm the customers at Marston, so I take issue with saying constables who stop us. I also had a successful proposition, which is road safety as hierarchy of road users. So exactly that would happen on a green, or a lane, that pedestrians take, and then it's horse riders, cyclists, cars, motorbikes. So actually, I brought that proposition in as a constable, and that was successful, and we are rolling that out at the moment.
Okay. That's really good to hear, and I'm familiar with the idea of road user hierarchies. So in simple terms, this is the idea that you, in your policies, in your guidance and essentially your transport thinking, you say, we're first trying to make things better for pedestrians, then cyclists, then I think public transport, and then a car driver is the last group that we focus on in the hierarchy. We have a lot of local authorities and other bodies in the UK that have adopted those road user hierarchies. What I know is a problem is actually putting that into practice. So you can have the vision statements, but here I can hear Brent Toderian, the guy I quoted earlier from Vancouver, the guy who came up with that stool, the kind of three-pronged thinking about family-friendly places. He says, if you want to really see a town or a city's priorities, don't look at its vision statements, look at its budgets, because that's where you see where the priorities really are. And Rotterdam, by the way, is an example of that. Rotterdam used to spend most of its transport budget on cars. But when I visited in 2018, the transport people were telling me that 50% of the transport budget, in other words, the transport department budgets in Rotterdam were being spent on walking and cycling. Now, I will leave that for you here to consider in a Jersey context.
It's just going on your liability question, really.
Yes.
Last month I opened a sensory centre, a sensory integration therapist, and it's great when I'm there as a therapist and I get insurance for that. But I want to be able to use the space for families just to come and to use.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just really hard. I'm on my 20th insurance company, and it's like I just want a play space where people in Jersey that can come and book and just come as a family, and it's just really hard.
Okay.
Speak into that.
I should be able to say something about that. So another hat that I wear is that I'm chair of a body called the Play Safety Forum, which is a UK-wide grouping of people who are interested in play safety, getting a balanced approach, kind of tackling some of the obstacles, and insurance is an obstacle. In the UK, what we tend to say is it's the obvious one about shopping around, but it sounds like you've done that. Actually trying to get into a dialogue with the insurance world and really be clear about what you're doing and what the risks might be, and maybe looking to other precedents that you can point to beyond the island. But I'm not going to come up with any... It sometimes is hard. We've had some real problems with the insurance sector. And by the way, one of the problems is that the insurance world had to pay out a lot of money for all sorts of reasons that are nothing to do with our stuff. But what it's meant is that as a sector, it's now looking, frankly, to get some easy profits by ratcheting up premiums where maybe the risk is not quite as challenging. I don't know if there are insurance people in the room, but this is what people tell me on the quiet, that's been happening. And it happened 20 years ago when there were huge amounts of payouts for things like asbestosis. And those were, so you get a kind of big cohort of claims that just prompt premiums to rise or insurance markets to tighten in all sorts of sectors. And that is happening in the UK. So that might be part of your problem. That isn't the answer to your question, but I would actually try and get round the table with some, because one of the things about the insurance world also, these are people, right? I've done that exercise I did right at the very beginning, play memories exercise we call it. I've done that with groups of insurers and with health and safety managers. They have the same memories. So they maybe, if you could persuade them that there's a way for them not to be the bad guys in all of this, then that might, that might help. Or alternatively, you go to the press and you say, look, I've got this wonderful idea and there's a bunch of people who are stopping it and I think it's wrong, and call them out. That's the nuclear option. Especially on an island that has a big, chunk of its economy running on finance.
Hi, great talk.
Thank you.
I just want to understand how you manage noise in these urban environments with play spaces being so located next to houses, etc.
Yeah, okay. Where's Emily gone? Emily's got a nice story which I'll tell you. At St Martin's, there was some resistance. I think it was... Oh, is it your story? Tell me if I got the story wrong, because then I'll tell it differently next time. But let me tell it, and you tell me if I get it wrong. So in simple terms, there were some people in St Martin's who weren't keen on the idea of a playground because of the noise. I think it was the pétanque people. It was the pétanque people. And they were not happy, and they put up some resistance, but the constable stood her ground, and now the same people are saying, oh, actually, it's quite nice hearing children playing, and I don't know if they've admitted that their protests were wrong. So this is an example where often the fear outweighs the reality. Now, okay, there's a bit of a, we need to recognise that sometimes when children play, they do make a noise, and that we can't, it's not like we can get kids to sign a contract that says, yes, you can play in this playground, but you're not allowed to go above 50 decibels. That's not going to happen. But I think this is a case where surely what we need is a balanced approach. You're not going to have a big, raucous playground right next to, I don't know, a residential care home. But you can firstly find a middle ground. You can show some examples where people's fears did not get borne out by the reality, and maybe you can do some piloting, and you can run some sessions, and you can appeal to people's better nature. We've had various quotes around today about, but one I really like is let's remind ourselves that old people are young people who've lived a long time. So reconnecting older people, with their own childhoods and some of the things that they got up to, and in effect making a plea on behalf of this generation, can get you some traction and some progress, amongst the other stuff that I said.
Hi, very inspiring talk.
Thank you.
If you could put the most important people on the island on a bus, everyone was taking notes today, where would you send them for a field trip?
Really, really good question. You mean maybe not just a bus, it probably would need to involve a boat or a plane as well. And I've been thinking about, my hunch is there's probably some towns and cities in France that would be really interesting, but I don't know France that well, and I was talking to Emily about this. As a francophone, Emily would be a great person to figure out where you might go to in France. So I go to lots of conferences, I get invited to give lots of talks, but I don't get invited to France very often because I can't speak very good French, and French people don't necessarily like to speak English very much when they're on their home turf, and that's completely understandable. But I reckon, and I've heard some stories about places like Nantes. Nantes I know is a big city. Lyon, some of the cities in the Bordeaux region. I just have a hunch that there's a lot going on in French cities that would speak to not just, obviously the kind of francophone and francophile culture here, but where the built form of those places might be quite similar. But maybe somebody in the room's got some suggestions.
I've seen some lovely playgrounds people have sent me. I get sent a lot of photos from friends or people I know. Southampton has got some lovely playgrounds, really natural playscapes, and they look great.
Yeah. In England, I'm struggling to think of cities that might speak to people here. I'm not familiar with Southampton. I think Ghent is a really interesting city in that it's bigger than here, but it's got a historic core. It's got a 19th century ring around it. It's got suburbs, and I think that city's over 20 years done an amazing amount of work. Lots of different types of interventions, to use the jargon, to make that city really come alive for children and families. You could sort of think about heading there. It's also a lovely place to visit. Pontevedra in Spain, people talk about. I've never been, not a very big city. There's incredible work to shift away from the car, open up public space. And the mayor there, he's been the mayor for about 20 years. He keeps on getting re-elected because, and this is a city that I think is quite an aging population, but he gets re-elected because people just like like him doing what he's doing, and he's very outspoken about the value of what he's doing for children and young people.
So my name is Christine. I just wanted to agree with you that France shows some great opportunities and a very much a different culture in terms of providing the pocket parks in what is often very residential, flat-based towns and cities. I thought your examples of Vauban and Rotterdam were also really good.
Yeah.
But I thought it might also be really interesting for people who are here today to understand that the previous government did actually put into our government plan 2 years ago now money to ensure that we develop additional parks and open spaces within our town, and we have identified a succession of actions that need to happen to achieve that, and also a sustainable transport route through town to connect up those green lanes of St Saviour in the east and the north with our open spaces in town, to try and improve the way that people can get around town without needing cars, and ultimately to enable the delivery of pocket parks as we remove park cars on-street parking. So all is not lost, and there have been people who have been very focused on this, and I just thought it might be helpful for everyone in the room to understand that if they haven't managed to pick up on that information, because that budget is still there.
Thank you very much. And my sense is, in case it wasn't clear, is that there is quite a lot of, there's quite a lot of good and positive and progressive things happening here, but they're not very well connected, they're patchy, and they can maybe sort of petering out. And these are difficult issues, but I think I want to really underscore the message at the end that every town and city on earth now is facing some tough challenges to figure out how to change and grow and evolve, and for all sorts of reasons. And what I'm trying to argue is that thinking about children and bringing children into the picture is not only a powerful way to make places work better for children and young people, it's also a compelling way to elevate those conversations and to get a focus on the longer term, a focus on the kind of collective good, and to figure out what you might want St Helier or Jersey to look like in concrete terms in 20, 40 years' time, in ways that you can build a consensus and some shared vision for. Because we do care about children, and we're conscious about the fact that they've got more of their lives ahead of them than the rest of us. And that's a pretty strong motivating force, and it can help to overcome what are otherwise some tricky vested interests. It's not a silver bullet, but it really helps.
Does Jersey have a children's minister? We do. So Sheffield, your picture of Sheffield,
yes,
tells us everything. And what I ask you, is the chap who wanders up to, a mile and a half away, is he a lighter person that is not allowed to go more than 300 meters? You haven't mentioned children's health
I did briefly,
weight
so here we go. I've mentioned activity. So there's lots of evidence, and there's a growing body of evidence about the health benefits for children, and for that matter adults, of what are sometimes called environmental factors. So green space, walkable neighbourhoods. There's a big body of evidence around mental health and physical health. So that's there, and that's coming from data from studies all over the world. There's a huge study in Denmark, for instance, that for millions, I think over 1 million children, showing the links between their mental health issues and their access to green space. So the science is fairly clear. The challenge is figuring out what you do about that. Yeah, and also I think figuring out how to get that mainstreamed and embedded in sort of standard thinking.
Your Sheffield picture is all about motor cars, totally the motor cars.
I think so. I mean, I think it is also fair to say, though, that there are other factors. You know, even though crime levels have gone down for the last 40 or 50 years, surveys tell us that people are more afraid of crime. There are certainly some neighbourhoods where there is a real problem with crime. There are also changes to the way families live now, and 50 years ago, most households would be, typically a mother, but anyway, one family member who'd be at home. So that change with both mothers and fathers working more hours, as well as changes in family structures, is another factor that means it's less likely for kids to just be playing and roaming around their neighbourhood. I can remember my own childhood growing up in a village in Buckinghamshire. My mum worked full time, but my two best friends, their mums were typically home often, so we'd often be calling in and out, checking in, getting a drink of water, blah, blah, blah. Of course, there are also these. But one of the nice things about the Sheffield story is it reminds us that these only came along really 10 years ago, so that story goes back a lot further. And so yes, ultimately I agree with you. I think the single biggest factor has been the growth of kind of the presence of the car in neighbourhoods. But it is fair to say it's not the only factor, and it's a complex story.
My question's been answered that there is a children's minister, but I'd be quite interested to understand who has the biggest impact in government in terms of putting forward children's needs and wants in terms of their social cohesion in these spaces.
Right.
So in Jersey, we've got places like Fort Regent. We have swimming pools as well that have space around them. And quite often you see in the news that these places or decisions are being made about these areas. And there doesn't seem to be much stakeholder input from perhaps children and families.
Yeah. I can't give a direct answer to that question. I think it varies from place to place and from bureaucracy to bureaucracy. You're really talking about how bureaucracies work and how to get them to work well. And honestly, we have this debate all the time in England about this stuff. Do we need a cabinet level children's minister? Do we need a single department that brings together these different functions? Or alternatively, do we need a strategy that's sat inside the Prime Minister's office? So in other words, the cabinet office. And different people have different views, and it's a bit above my pay grade to call out what's best. I do think that one thing that seems to be common in a lot of cities, it is this hub and spoke model. And what that means is that the one person, or maybe a team, they tend to be based in something like planning or public health maybe, or I don't know, urban regeneration. They're rarely based in children's services, because often in children's services, the senior managers, what are they concerned about? They're concerned about schools, often. They're concerned about child protection, children who are really at risk. So those people are rarely going to be confident about getting involved in talking with urban planners and transport people. But that's a hunch and nothing more than a hunch. But it's why I'm very pleased to be here talking with architects and the like, because even if you do need the strategic leader to be somewhere else, you very quickly need that level of bureaucracy that's actually involved in planning, urban design, transport, public space, parks. You need those people, recreation. You need those people really on board and going in the same direction. And again, if you've missed it, one of the messages that I'd like to leave is that it's clear you've got some, quite a complex bureaucracy here on Jersey, and sometimes not everybody pushing in the same direction. And the more that we can get those groups of people to work together, in the parishes, in the government, with the different agencies, the more likely I think you are to do a better job for children and families. That's obvious, isn't it, really? We've got a missing mic.
That's one.
Hi there, I really enjoyed your talk this evening. I'm speaking as an educator and a father of a 5-year-old, and somebody that's not long been in Jersey, but is trying to be one of those people that stays in the long term. A little bit older than 30, unfortunately. It's funny really, because it came across to me that everything that you've spoken about is all research-based, that has clear economic benefits for an island that is bemoaning the fact that we have an Asian population, we're not looking after the young people that are trying to stay here. It almost seems like a no-brainer. And for me to want my son to grow up here, which I do, I think this is vital for the government to really take a grip on, because the facts speak for themselves. And if Jersey is really serious about having a long-term plan that isn't going to fall to pieces in 20 years, hopefully we can sort of put a little bit of pressure on the government to really, we have an island plan that dictates everything that goes on the island, and perhaps something written to the island plan that reflects some of your research, I think would be a really valuable thing.
Thank you. Well, you probably just said my closing words for me, but I'll only add the mayors that I've seen that have made amazing things happen. I'm thinking in particular there's a guy called Erion Vellier. He's the mayor of Tirana. So he's a bit like Europe's version of Peñalosa. I was lucky enough to, and it's an amazing place to visit, Albania, but honestly, that country was broken 30 years ago. It had come out of communism and then 5 years of gangster capitalism of the worst kind. It almost fell into civil war, and so he's made the child, if you like, the child of Tirana, the capital city, into the kind of symbol and the sort of driving force for making that city better. And he's done some amazing things in a city that does not have much money. So I think, and he's done it partly as a relatively young father and a very eloquent and persuasive guy. So I think there's a lot we can learn from that sort of political, long-term political vision that I hope some people here on Jersey can take a leaf out of his book.
I think we can close there, and all thank Tim very, very much for your expertise and insight. And I do want to close with a few words of hope. First project, last year, Karen and I met, and within 6 months there was a new playground in St Martin's. A few months later, Simon Crowcroft got in touch, and we're working on 2 new playgrounds just across here in Parade Gardens. And I am trying to grow collaborative relationships with housing and government, and hopefully JDC and the here and ports, and just anyone who's got any spaces. Youth services are amazing as well. We can all work together to improve outcomes for children, and I think that's really what tonight's about. We've got planners here, we've got amazing creatives from the skate community, the bike community couldn't make it, but I'm so excited by the passionate creatives that I've met and had the privilege of working with, and this is just the beginning. So thank you for coming for the initial conversation, and let's hope there'll be many more and some awesome projects that we can all input into. Thank you.